live. This is Chris at Infinite Realities, and as everything we've been doing the last 2 weeks, we have been talking to our favorite creators, and today is one that I've been looking forward to. Mr. Steve Engelhart, how are you, sir?
I'm doing good. I tell people that this new lifestyle is not a whole lot different from my old lifestyle. I just sat around my house and did my work there from the start. So the only difference is you can't just say, hey, I'll go down to the comic book store today. You know,
Sure.
I mean, you don't get the ways to break it off. But otherwise, I'm fine.
Well, listen, I appreciate your time. I was gonna do like a list of like the top Steve Engelhart stories, but it is a huge list, y'all. If you're a Steve Engelhart fan, you know. If you're not, this fan, he's had iconic runs on Avengers, Doctor Strange, the Defenders, creator of Star-Lord. You're the fella that integrated Patsy Walker into the Marvel superhero universe, which I kind of wanted to start with that one because we've got a Patsy Walker following here at Infinite Realities. So can you talk about that? For those not in the know, she was a romance character for decades.
Right. When I was when I was a fan, I read everything. And that included the romance books and the Western books and the monster books and the stuff by Charlton and Gold Key. And I mean, just everything, because it was all a dime or 12 cents or something like that. And I was interested in the whole thing. So I read Patsy Walker and Patsy and Hetty and those other romance books. And so when the Fantastic Four got married in FF Annual number 4, I think, they come out of the church and there's a crowd of people. And it's like everybody in the Marvel Universe is all standing out there waiting to congratulate Reed and Sue. And in that crowd threw in Patsy and Hetty, which was their first appearance in the Marvel Universe, right? But that was just a joke. But when I was writing The Beast, they gave me The Beast because I was the new guy on the block and the Beast had not sold, and this was like, could we make it sell if we made him look more like a werewolf and this kind of stuff, which was fine. But when you're writing a character, you're in charge of all of their ancillary characters, and the Beast didn't really have any. He had the X-Men, but they weren't being published, and so I needed some way to kind of widen the story, break the story out, and I thought, for whatever reason, Patsy Walker. Why not bring Patsy Walker? Nobody else is using her. I mean, I can't go get Dr. Doom and say, I'll put him in my book, right? So I brought her in and she made the Beast promise that he was gonna do something for her if she helped him out. And then the series got canceled. And so we never got to see what that was until later in the Avengers when I brought him in and her in and finished off that storyline. But it was mostly just looking for some way to make the story bigger, and she was the most available person, I guess. I mean, nobody else had thought of doing anything with her, so there she was.
Well, it's crazy because, again, I know when I dropped that piece of trivia on people that she was a romance character before, they have to verify it. They rush to the internet to make sure I'm not pulling their leg.
Well, for years, Patsy and Hetty and Patsy Walker was kind of an Archie type strip, kind of a just, teen thing. But a couple of years, I think after the superhero thing started and Peter Parker had his soap opera moments of, his Aunt May and his girlfriends and all this, stamped the romance books into an ongoing soap opera, which I liked better because it was a story, right? But they also became more closer to people than just Archie characters, whatever. So, I mean, it was if you like romance, I don't know who does anymore these days, but those books are worth, I mean, they're not great comics per se, but they're fun. And DC also was doing good romance soap operas during that time. As I say, I read everything, and I was just interested in characters and comics, so it didn't make any difference to me whether it was romance or monsters or superheroes.
Steve, what was your journey from fan to professional? How did you get there?
That's a long story. I think we just used the entire half hour.
Okay.
I was a fan, And I was also of an age to get drafted into the Army for Vietnam back in the day. And my favorite artist at the time was Neil Adams. And somehow I knew that he hung around DC Comics doing his work. He liked to work in one of their unused offices up there. I don't remember how I knew that, but I was stationed in Maryland. And one Friday afternoon, I was off duty for the weekend. And I just hopped on a train and I went up to New York and went to DC, and somehow they let me in. And I got to talk to Neil, and I said, when I get out of the Army, I'd really like to I'm an artist. I was at the time, like to work with you. And he said, if you know Neil Adams at all, he said, why don't we start now? Right. And I said, well, because I'm in the Army. And he goes, well, you can come up here every weekend, right? And I go, yeah. And he said, all right, well then, so for the last 6 months of my time in the Army, I would go to New York every weekend. I would work with Neil at DC on Friday. Then I'd go out to his house on Saturday. His wife would feed me. And we did this story for Vampirella called The Sweet Soft Lips of Hell. It was a backup story. It wasn't a Vampirella story. And he insisted that I get my name on it as by Neil Adams and Steve Engelhart, because he said, then you'll have a published credit and that will be useful. And it was. And so when I got out of the Army, I went to New York and started doing the young artist in New York thing. And, and I had jobs and I was doing this and that and the other thing. And to try to wrap this up quickly, I ended up getting a staff job at Marvel at one point. Well, the detail's interesting. Gary Friedrich. All right, backing it up again. In those days, to work in comics, you had to physically go to New York. It was before the internet, before FedEx, before all that stuff. So you could hand stuff to people and they could hand you things. And so you got to know everybody in comics, which was very cool. I mean, there was this little bubble of all the comics people in New York City. And so I got to know everybody and they got to know me. And the nice thing was nobody treated me as the new kid. It's just like, no, you're in the club. Come on, That's awesome. Comics is like that. So I got to know Gary Friedrich. A stewardess got murdered in the apartment above Gary Friedrich's apartment. His wife said, let's get out of New York for the summer, go back to Missouri, where Gary was from. And so Gary called me up and he said, do you want to fill in for me on staff at Marvel? It was, the lowest level assistant editor job thing. And I almost said no. I didn't really want to have a day job, but I was a Marvel fan. So I thought, okay, fine. So I got the assistant editor job at Marvel. At the end of 6 weeks, Gary decided he didn't want to come back from Missouri. He didn't even want to script this little monster story that he was supposed to script. So he sent it back. And Roy Thomas looked around the room and he goes, you want to write this thing? And I'm like, sure, why not? I'm an artist, but I'll write it. And I enjoyed writing it. And they liked what I wrote. So then they said, hey, you want to do some more? And then we went from there. And in fact, I wrote some romance stories because in those days, you didn't get to jump immediately onto, Fantastic Four. You started out writing romance or Westerns or monsters to kind of get used to the process and they could continue to evaluate you. So wrote some romance stories, wrote some monster stories, and eventually got the Beast. And then they liked that. And then everything came after that. So it was kind of a thing of wanting to have it happen and being in the right place so it could happen. But, and I mean, they liked what I wrote, so they gave me more writing, but it wasn't as if I had shown up as a writer and fought my way up through the ranks or anything like that. It was just, I was there and nobody else wanted to do it. And it's like, oh, well, okay. So I don't know that it's going to teach anybody how to get into comics, but, that's how I got there.
Hey, this is comics. People like origin stories, right?
Yeah.
When you took over Avengers, you're following, at that point, Roy Thomas, right?
All right.
Who is wrapping up a very big run. Like he's been on it for a minute.
Excellent run, too.
So what was your approach to following that up? to leaving your mark on, coming after an excellent run, to your point?
Well, being a new writer, new to the concept of writing, I totally admired what Roy had done. And so therefore I set out to kind of do Roy stories, trying to, how does Roy shape a story? What's the vibe? All that kind of stuff. I was trying to emulate that for a while. And what really changed it was the Avengers Defenders clash. But even more than that, it's a little trickier than that. I had brought in Mantis. I had created Mantis once again to kind of enlarge the possibilities of the story thing. I mean, she hadn't pre-existed, obviously, but my idea was she was going to be this slut who was going to come in by being the swordsman's prostitute girlfriend, and she was going to like put the moves on all of the male Avengers and cause dissension in the ranks and all this kind of stuff. And I got her there. And then that very month, Roy said, we're not going to do any annuals this summer. I don't remember why, but Marvel had done annuals. And as a fan, I had liked the summer. You get special stuff for the summer. So I said, well, I'm writing the Avengers and the Defenders at this point. Why don't I do some sort of big crossover thing for the summer, which will kind of be like our annual? And the great thing about Marvel in those days is Roy said, if you're late on any one of those books, the whole thing just tumbles like dominoes. And I said, I won't be late. And he said, okay. And that was the entire editorial oversight of that. So I'm working out the whole Avengers Defenders thing. And all of a sudden I got this character, Mantis, who's got to be like a good teammate. Because the Avengers Defenders is like each team they're fighting each other. I can't do a thing with some slut seducing people in the middle of the Avengers Defenders thing. So she ended up being a good teammate to the Black Panthers, I recall. And that totally changed her and also sort of changed my attempt to try to do Roy's thing anymore. All of a sudden I was doing my thing. It was like, I really, the whole Avengers Defenders thing just kind of spun off, and then her origin came out of that, and all that sort of thing, and that's pretty much when I changed, and realized, as one should, I'm not Roy Thomas. I shouldn't be writing Roy Thomas stories. I should be writing my stories, whatever they are. So that's. I didn't realize that for a long time, how the Avengers Defenders had changed Mantis, but that's why she changed. And then all of a sudden I had her and I didn't know who she was. So then I was exploring her for the next year and a half.
Well, so you look at your Marvel output. You've got the Avengers. You've got the Defenders. You create Star-Lord. You create Valkyrie. Co-create Shang-Chi.
Didn't create Valkyrie. Roy created Valkyrie.
Oh, Roy.
I brought her in.
My apologies.
That's all right.
But then, and I've seen interviews before where Jeanette Kahn calls.
Right.
At DC.
Right.
How did she get you? What was the pitch to get you from Marvel to DC?
Well, I had just quit Marvel at that point. I'd had a blow up with editorial and had walked out the door. And my wife had traveled in Europe for a year by herself back before she knew me. And I thought that sounded pretty cool. So I said, screw it. Let's go to Europe. I mean, I just quit comics. Let's go to Europe. And at that point, Jeanette Kahn called and said she had just been appointed publisher at DC. DC had really sort of been trending downward for a long time. Everybody who was cool had gone to Marvel. Neil Adams had gone to Marvel. Gil Kane had gone to Marvel. Bob Brown had gone to Marvel. Marvel was just the place to be, and DC wasn't. And so Jeanette wanted to turn that around. And her idea was, let's hire that Marvel guy that is now available. So she said, what I want you to do is come in and revamp the entire Justice League. I need you to do for the Justice League what you did for the Avengers. Give them all personalities, give them stories, give them all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, I can only do it for a certain amount of time because I'm already scheduled to go to Europe. And that was fine. I also said I want to do the Batman in his own book because I love the Batman, and if I'm only going to do it for a short amount of time, I want to do the Batman. She was amenable. Anything that I wanted, I wasn't asking for the moon, and she was willing to give me that stuff. So in the Justice League, we did a monthly 34-page book because that was the only way to be able to expand on people's characters and still have a story. Mm-hmm. I mean, the books were 17 pages in those days, and if you were going to try to do anything, you couldn't do it with the entire Justice League blossoming in 17 pages. So I was able to get 34 pages a month, and I'm really happy with all that stuff. That stuff didn't get reprinted until last year because that's DC. But I was quite happy to be doing the Justice League and all that kind of stuff. But I was also doing the Batman, and that's the stuff that's better known now. But it was mostly, she needed to figure out some way to make the company work, and I was a representative of the company that was making it work, so she hired me.
And you went from doing the Marvel style of writing to full scripts, correct?
Yeah, in a way. I was so used to the Marvel style, which for people who don't know is you tell the artist everything that he needs to know about the story, you give him a synopsis, then you let him draw it the way he wants to, which I prefer because I'd rather he have some freedom, right? And then it comes back and you write the dialogue for it, which I also prefer because then if I'm looking at the same picture you're looking at, then I don't have to write things that you don't need to have written, I mean, it's like I can see what you're going to see, so I just have to amplify that or whatever. So when I went to DC, the other way is pretty simple. Panel 1, he says, she says. Panel 2, I mean, it's like a movie script, but it was boring to me. And so what I did for the first, for a while, I wrote just straight dialogue as if I had artwork to be looking at. I just wrote, without any scene descriptions or anything, I just wrote the dialogue the way it came into my head because that's the way it worked for me. And then when I was all done with it, then I just sort of wrote all the scene descriptions, all in one section. So it was up to the artist then to go to the back and see what the scene was, go to the front, get the dialogue in there, I guess. Nobody ever came and punched me in the face for having done this. So, but it was very hard. It was hard for me. I had done it. I wrote Vampirella way back in the early days, and I wrote that full script. I'd done stuff full script, but I was really used to the flow of the Marvel thing, and so it took me a while to get over to the full script sort of thing. Full scripts are better for editors because then they have everything in front of them and they can edit, but not as much fun for writers, I don't think.
Well, one of the cool things I liked about your Batman run is that it's dark, it's broody, but it's not grim dark, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, grim came later, and if I'd been doing it 10 years later, maybe I would have done grimmer than I did. But I was trying to do basically what it got called, the definitive Batman. I was trying to sum up everything that I had intuited about Batman and had loved about Batman and everything to that point. And try to just say, this is the summation of all the stuff that's gone before. So I went and plucked the whole pulp darkness thing out of the 40s. The first year of Detective Comics was very dark. I mean, visually, not, it wasn't grim, but they had a lot of black ink on the page, right? And I thought that looked cool, and I thought it worked for the Batman. So I would go and get stuff from there, but then also I wanted to make Batman an adult, which is why I gave him Silver St. Cloud and a sex life, right? I mean, so that he was not just this kind of figure in a cowl. He was a person who was an adult. So I was taking all the things that I thought were that were cool and that I thought needed to be added and all that. And so I came up with what I came up with. Basically, I took the Joker as he stood at the time from 0 to 60, and then other people have taken it to 6 million since then.
Yeah.
Right? But he was scary in the context of the time. shall we say.
Well, speaking of Joker, we have a question. Brian Pruitt asks, how did you feel having your Joker story done on Batman, the animated series?
Oh, I thought it was cool. I mean, because they did it pretty much verbatim. Other people, other stories they would adapt in their own way, whatever, but they used pretty much what I wrote until they ran out of time until they ran out of story, and then had to tack a Denny O'Neil other story on the end of it to make it run half an hour or whatever. But no, I thought it was a nice honor, to be included in there anyway, but also the fact that they like the original story enough to just kind of like replicate it. I'm a big fan of being true to, I mean, if somebody else has done something and I'm going to like run with it, I try to give them their due, try to, not just say, hey, I'm here, it's all different. It's like, no, I want to work on what you did. I'm reminded very tangentially when they made Nightman. Nightman was a Malibu comic in the 90s, and they made a TV series out of it. And they kind of upped his powers, and they gave him a black guy that he could talk to, because I learned in television you need to have somebody to talk to, because otherwise that's how else are you going to explain what people are doing. I mean, there were all these television tropes, right? But the character was the same guy, and I appreciated that. It didn't bother me that they'd changed his powers or added other characters or whatever, but Nightman himself was the character that I wrote, and it was the same with the Batman thing. If they're gonna do my stuff, I would like them to do it the way I did it, and in those cases they did.
Well, Buck Cook writes, thank you for all the stories you created, but especially the incredible work you did with Batman.
Thank you, Buck.
Now, you revisited the Batman stuff with Dark Detective.
Right.
Which stands as one of my favorite Batman stories as well. Did DC approach you for that? Did you approach them? How did Dark Detective come about? Also, if you guys don't know, you have that Joker, vote for me.
Yeah.
Or kill you.
Yeah. Which I still think is a cool concept. I've made no secret of the fact that I'm not a big DC fan, and it mostly comes from the whole Batman thing, in that they made a movie out of the first one. They hired me on to help shape that movie. Then they changed Silver St. Cloud's name to Vicky Vale and gave me no credit and didn't publish anything of mine for years by me and Marshall. So it had been 25, 30 years since that detective run, with no, backing from DC. In fact, more like trying to sweep it under the carpet as to exactly who did that stuff. So Marshall and I were at a WonderCon in San Francisco, and Dan DiDio came by, and he's the one who said, we want you guys to come back and do this. And at the time, I thought, it's a new guy and he's got a new approach. No, it was the same old DC approach, as it turned out. The king is dead. So they came. Sorry,
said the king is dead. Long live the king.
Yeah. So they, he asked us to do another thing, and we were very happy to do that, because we were very pleased with what we did the first time, and had been frustrated for 30 years that they never let us do it again, so doing it again was pretty cool. And then there was going to be a third run, but they canceled that, and they sort of strip mined a lot of that stuff for the Christopher Nolan movies, and that's all part of why I'm not a DC fan. But the work is fun. Writing comics, drawing comics, that's fun. The business part of it, if you're dealing with a corporation like DC, is not fun. But the work is there. The work got done. So, what
was it Kirby said? Comics will break your heart, kid.
Probably. Yeah. Kirby was the canary in that coal mine. I mean, he's the guy who really got big and really got shunted aside. It was sort of a caution. I paid attention to that at the time. I thought, I'm not gonna end up in that situation necessarily. So.
Well, I do want to circle back. We're coming up towards the end. I've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to be selfish right now and talk about something near and dear to my heart is your amazing, epic Doctor Strange, which I tell everybody I ever talk to is my favorite. I love Ditko, everything he did, but for my money, Steve Engelhart, Frank Bruner, Doctor Strange.
Yeah, and Gene Colan too. People forget Gene Colan, which is an odd thing to do. But yeah, I mean, Brunner was spectacular. Brunner really sort of was one of a kind, and so even Gene couldn't. He gets forgotten. Gene gets forgotten. But I did do another year with Gene. Well, anybody that I wrote, I tried to do the definitive version of it, at least in my head, right? What is this guy? Who is this guy? What can make him shine as brightly as possible? I mean, that's just because I loved all those guys and I wanted to do right by them, right? So when I got Brunner asked me to do Doctor Strange. He had been doing it with Gardner Fox and he hadn't been really happy. Gardner Fox was real old school and Brunner was not. So Frank asked me to do it, and I thought, well, I had written him Doctor Strange in the Defenders, but there he was a magician who was part of a superhero team. If I was going to write him all by himself, I wanted to explore the magic end of things. I wanted to really see what that was about. So I started reading up. I started, reading about astrology and tarot and all this sort of thing to kind of just get a sense of, I mean, if he's the Sorcerer Supreme and I'm supposed to convince you that he's the Sorcerer Supreme, I should have some knowledge of what world he's actually operating in. So that was my thing. And then because Frank had asked me on and he had, he'd been chafing to do ideas, we did that book as a team. I mean, every time it was time to do a Doctor Strange issue, we would get together either at his place in New York City or mine. I was living in Connecticut at the time. And, he'd say, well, here's the things I want to see in the next issue. And I'd go, well, here's the things I want to see in the next issue. And then we'd sit there as long as it took, way into the night sometimes, to kind of figure out how do we put those things together to make something that's better than the sum of its parts. And that's how we did it. With Gene, it was different. Gene just wanted to draw the book. And so that was all, I was totally in charge of the story with Gene. Right. But with Frank, it was a team effort. And, I have very fond memories of, sitting there in New York at 3:30 in the morning, getting some ice cream from the deli across the street and still trying to figure out, because it was my job as the writer. It was my job to make sure that it did all fit together. Yeah. It wasn't just, oh, here's a bunch of cool concepts. I wanted to make a story out of it. So that was, but Frank would throw me things that I hadn't been thinking about. So then it's like, oh, I got to put that in there, and how's that going to work? And then things would expand. And so that was just fun.
Steve, I feel like an entire book could be written about your contribution to comics, and we could spend all weekend talking about it, but I know we're coming up to the end of the 30 minutes. What are you working on right now?
I'm doing a thing basically it's basically from myself. I set out to do this sort of, basically it's a mini series, except each chapter is like a graphic album, like 60 pages long. It started out at 44, but it's kind of gone to 60. It's basically, there's a small town in California, and we get to know at least 16 people. There's like 16 ongoing storylines, which is the first thing that a writer would find interesting. 2 of those people gain superpowers. And at first, we don't know who they are. So it's like there's superheroes, but we're still following all these 16 different people, except 2 of those people have a secret life that we're not connecting just yet. And then later I connect it, and then it starts to expand. But it's basically this extremely challenging writer's challenge. Mm-hmm. which is why I started to do it. I'm getting sort of toward the end of it. It's sort of hard to say because with 16 characters, you kind of like with Brunner, you kind of keep going, oh, but I could do this too, you know? And it's like, can you do that and make it all fit together? And can you do that? So when I get done with it, then I will look for an artist. And I'm not sure there is an artist who wants to draw, you know, a series of 60-page books with, 20 different characters in it. And I look for a publisher. And if none of that comes to pass, I will still have had the fun of writing it. But we'll just see. You may have it behind you on the shelves in the years to come, or you may not, you know.
Well, I'm going to harass you for it. Because like I said, I'm a lifelong Steve Engelhart fan. So the promise of new Engelhart material, yeah, you got a retailer here in Atlanta area that's going to be on you about it.
Okay.
Steve, thank you so much for your time today. We
Sure
so appreciate it.
I hope you guys all stay safe down there.
Hey, likewise to you too, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Engelhart.